Snow dusted the pavement like powdered glass as the hospital lights poured a golden river across the entrance. The doors hissed open and shut in a steady rhythm, sending a mild warmth into the frozen evening, but the warmth never reached the small puppy curled beside the revolving glass. His fur was clumped and dull, his ribs faintly visible beneath the scruff, yet his gaze never wavered. He watched the corridor as if it held the last thread of his world. Nurses passed with brisk footstep. Visitors shuffled by with tired eyes and paper cup. The puppy did not beg and did not whine. He simply waited, still as a shadow stamped into ice. Dr. Thomas Walker stepped out beneath the awning, the cold immediately needling his cheek. The day had been a blur of charts and hushed decisions, the kind of day that left a humming emptiness in his chest. He paused when he noticed the small shape by the door. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags, then the bundle lifted its head and the eyes found him. There was no fear in them, only a patient, aching focus that made the air feel thinner. A janitor pushed a mop through the foyer and traded a weary nod with the doctor. The world went on with its work. The puppy did not move. Something in the doctor resisted the scene. He was not a man of animals or soft impulses. He measured life by what could be repaired with steady hands and defined protocols. Yet the stillness of that dog worked like a quiet bell in his thought. Snow began to fall harder. Flakes peppered the puppy's back and gathered along the line of the curb. The animal blinked but did not seek shelter. A tremor ran through its body, subtle at first, then more visible, a shiver that looked like a held breath, finally failing. The doctor returned to his car, opened the trunk, and found an old travel blanket he kept for highway emergencies. He carried it back and knelt as close as the dog would allow. The puppy watched his hands carefully. The blanket settled over the small body with a weight that felt ceremonial, as if he were tucking a page into a fragile book. For a moment the dog relaxed, then lifted its head again to face the doors. The gaze returned to that invisible point down the corridor, resolute as a vow. Inside, the lobby television flickered between weather alerts and community notices. A nurse named Sarah slowed near the door and glanced out, her face softening when she saw the covered shape. The doctor found himself lingering where the warm light met the winter air. He asked if anyone had reported a lost dog. The answer drifted back with a shrug and a faint smile that held both pity and acceptance. No reports. No inquiries. Only the nightly ritual of a tiny sentinel refusing to yield to the cold. He stayed longer than he intended. The hospital's hum receded, until all he heard was the wind skimming across the parking lot and the faint tick of the automatic doors. He thought of the rooms upstairs, of machines that whispered and screens that glowed, of hands he had held and hands he had let go. He wondered what thread tethered this animal to the threshold, and why the thread felt familiar. The puppy shifted beneath the blanket and the doctor noticed a spot worn smooth on the concrete, a hollow polished by many nights of waiting. It looked like devotion pressed into stone. The snowfall thickened. The clock on the wall above reception clicked toward another hour he did not want to claim. He told himself this was nothing more than a stray with a habit. He told himself there were limits to what a person could carry. He told himself to go home. His feet did not listen. He stood there with the cold in his lungs and the strange certainty that the story was not outside the hospital. It was passing through it, leaving traces, and pausing every evening at these doors to see if anyone would notice. At last he forced himself toward the lot, the tires of his car crunching over fresh ice as he backed away. In the rearview mirror the blanket was a small island of color against the pale ground, a lighthouse for someone who had not returned. He drove into the dark with a new weight in his coat pocket and a new restlessness in his chest. Tomorrow, he told himself without words. Tomorrow he would ask better questions. Tomorrow he would follow the thread. The next evening, the cold felt sharper, the kind that cut through wool and bone. Dr. Thomas Walker stepped out of the hospital with a head full of patient charts and unfinished reports, yet his eyes went straight to the spot by the doors. The puppy was there, Exactly as before, as if time had folded and replayed the same moment. Snow clung to his fur in tiny crystals, his breath rising in slow, steady clouds. He didn't flinch at the opening and closing of the doors, nor at the swirl of feet around him. It was as if nothing in the world existed, except that invisible someone he was waiting for. Thomas hesitated at the edge of the awning. He was not sure why he had come this way instead of through the side exit, but he knew the answer without saying it. His gaze met the dog's, and in that silent exchange, something tightened in his chest. "You're still here," he murmured, though he knew the animal wouldn't answer. A voice from behind startled him. It was the same janitor, broom in hand, shaking his head with the weary amusement of someone who had seen this many times before. "Been here for weeks," he said. "Some folks think he's waiting for a patient. Maybe one who ain't coming back." The words landed heavier than they should have. Thomas found himself glancing at the lit windows above, imagining someone fading away in one of those rooms, their final tether curled up faithfully at the door below. That night, he returned to his car but didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he watched from a distance, headlights dimmed. The dog didn't move, didn't beg for food or shelter, only sat in still devotion, eyes fixed on the hospital. The following days became a pattern. Thomas began carrying a small dish of water and a packet of food, leaving them quietly near the dog's spot. Each morning the bowls would be empty. Yet the dog kept his distance, accepting the offerings without changing his post. It was not hunger that rooted him there, it was loyalty. One evening, as Thomas approached with another packet of food, the wind carried a soft voice from inside the hospital. Nurse Sarah was by the door, crouched low, one hand stretched toward the dog. To Thomas's surprise, the puppy didn't pull away. Instead, his ears twitched, and he let her fingers graze his head. "He's starting to trust," she said with a faint smile when she noticed Thomas. The doctor crouched beside her, his gloved hand hovering just short of the animal's fur. The dog lifted his eyes to meet his, and in them was a mixture of hope and sorrow so raw that Thomas had to look away for a moment. He felt it then, this wasn't a stray's empty wandering. This was a vigil, and whatever or whoever the dog waited for, it was tied to this hospital. When Thomas rose, the snow had begun to fall again, blurring the street lights into soft halos. He told himself he would find out the truth. The thought stayed with him like a pulse, steady and unavoidable. Tomorrow, he would start looking for answers. The next morning, the hospital corridors felt different to Thomas. The usual beeping monitors and murmured voices were still there, but beneath them ran a quiet current of urgency he couldn't shake. Between rounds, he stopped by the reception desk, leaning over slightly. "Any word on a missing dog?" he asked. The receptionist didn't even pause in her typing. "Nothing, doctor. No one's come asking." He nodded, though disappointment settled heavy in his chest. "If someone does, let me know. Please." All day, the thought of the little figure outside pulled at him like a thread. That evening, he left the hospital later than usual. The air was sharp, and the snow from earlier had frozen into a brittle crust underfoot. The dog was there, curled in his familiar spot, but tonight Thomas didn't stop at the edge of the awning. He crouched, setting a fresh blanket beside the food. The puppy's head lifted, eyes glinting in the dim light. His tail moved once, hesitant, before settling again. It was the smallest sign of acceptance, but it made Thomas feel like he had just crossed an invisible line. Over the next few nights, he kept watching, kept thinking, and then a fragment of a conversation stopped him cold. Two elderly patients in the waiting area were talking in low voices. "That little dog," one of them said, "reminds me of the story of the one who waited at a train station for years after his owner passed." The words sank deep. Could that be the truth here too? When his shift ended, Thomas found Sarah in the break room. "I need your help," he said quietly. "I want to check patient records. See if anyone matches the time the dog started appearing." Sarah hesitated, her eyes searching his face. That's not something we do lightly, Thomas. I know, he replied, but if this dog is waiting for someone, we might be the only ones who can piece it together. Hours later, after sifting through files, Sarah's breath caught. Here. Edward Langley. Came in 3 weeks ago. Heart attack. Passed shortly after. Lived alone. No next of kin. The name felt heavy in Thomas's mind. He stared at it, the letters blurring slightly. It could be coincidence. Or it could be the answer. That evening, he sat on the hospital steps with the dog beside him for the first time. The blanket wrapped around the small body like a fragile promise. Edward Langley, Thomas murmured, testing the name. The dog's ears twitched just slightly. And something in Thomas's chest tightened. If that was the truth, then this vigil wasn't just loyalty, it was grief. And grief, Thomas knew all too well. The next day, Thomas couldn't focus. Every time he glanced at his clipboard, the name Edward Langley seemed to rise off the page. Between patient checks, he found himself staring at the hospital doors, picturing the small figure outside. By evening, his decision was made. Edward's address was listed in the file. A modest home on the outskirts of town. The drive was quiet, the winter roads stretched out in pale ribbons beneath a low gray sky. When Thomas finally turned into a narrow lane, he saw it, a single-story house, paint peeling, shutters sagging, but still carrying a trace of warmth in its structure. The kind of place that had been loved, even if time had worn it thin. He knocked once, twice. No answer. A voice called from a garden next door. An older woman, wrapped in a faded coat, stood with a watering can in her hands. Her eyes narrowed briefly before softening. "Can I help you? I'm Dr. Thomas Walker," he said, stepping closer. "I work at the hospital where Edward Langley was admitted." At the mention of the name, her shoulders dropped. "Oh, bless his soul," she murmured. "Such a kind man. Kept to himself mostly, but loyal as they come." "Did he have a dog?" Thomas asked. Her expression brightened, though it was tinged with sadness. "Oh yes. Little one. Brown coat. Sweetest eyes you've ever seen. Followed Edward everywhere. You wouldn't see one without the other." Thomas's chest tightened. "Do you know what happened to the dog after Edward passed?" The woman shook her head slowly. "I assumed he ran off. Poor thing must have been heartbroken." She glanced toward the hospital, its roofline visible beyond the trees. "If he's still there, it's because he doesn't know Edward's gone. He's waiting for him to come back." Her words felt like a quiet key turning in Thomas's mind. By the time he returned to the hospital that evening, the snow had begun to fall again. The dog was in his place, eyes fixed on the doors as though nothing else mattered. Thomas crouched, his voice low. "You were his, weren't you? All this time, you've been waiting for Edward." The dog didn't move, but there was a softness now in the way he looked at Thomas. And in that moment, Thomas knew. He couldn't leave him here another night. Not anymore. The hospital's glass doors slid shut behind him with a faint hiss, sealing away the warmth. Thomas stepped into the cold with a small leash coiled in his hand, his breath curling in the dim light. The dog was there, as always, watching the entrance with quiet resolve. He crouched slowly, letting his voice fall to a gentle tone. "Hey, buddy. How about coming with me for a while? I'll take care of you." The dog hesitated, his tail giving the smallest uncertain wag. When Thomas extended the leash, the hesitation lingered, a silent weighing of trust against instinct. Finally, the little body shifted forward, allowing the loop to slide over his neck. It felt like a pact. Instead of turning toward the shelter, Thomas led him to his car. The dog climbed in without protest, curling into the passenger seat as though he had done it many times before. Thomas drove in silence, the road unwinding beneath the tires while snow streaked across the headlights. Every few minutes, he glanced at the quiet passenger beside him, feeling the strange pull of companionship. At home, Thomas set up a bed in the corner of the living room, draped with a clean blanket, and filled a bowl with fresh food and water. The dog sniffed cautiously at the new space before settling into the bed. "It's not the hospital," Thomas said quietly, crouching beside him, "but I hope you'll feel safe here." Over the next few days, the dog began to follow Thomas from room to room, never too far, always watchful. In the evenings, they would sit together in the soft glow of the lamp, the quiet filling in the spaces Thomas hadn't realized were empty. But some nights, the dog would sit by the door, staring out into the darkness. His ears would perk at the sound of a passing car, then droop again. It was as if he still expected someone else to walk through that door. One night, while Thomas was finishing dinner, the dog paced restlessly, whining softly before running to the front door. "What is it?" Thomas asked, setting down his fork. The dog looked back at him, eyes urgent, then darted into the yard. Thomas grabbed his coat and followed, the winter air biting at his skin. The dog led him through quiet streets, his pace steady and determined, until they reached a park at the edge of town. There, under the halo of a street lamp, sat an envelope on a weathered bench. On the front, in looping handwriting, were the words, "Edward Langley." The street lamp hummed faintly in the still night, its light pooling over the envelope like a quiet spotlight. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to reach for it. The dog sat beside the bench, tail sweeping slowly across the frosted ground, eyes fixed on the letter as if guarding it. Thomas picked it up. The paper was chilled from the winter air, edges slightly curled. He broke the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a folded sheet, the ink smudged in places but still legible. "My dearest companion," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I have left this world. But I need you to know how much you meant to me. You gave me joy when the days felt endless, comfort when the nights were heavy. You gave me a reason to keep going. If I could, I would never leave your side. I hope you find a heart that will care for you as I did, and I hope you never forget how loved you are." Thomas's breath caught, his eyes tracing each line again and again. The words were written as if Edward were speaking directly to the dog. No, not as if he was. When Thomas finished, his vision blurred. He lowered the letter and felt the dog rest his head gently on his knee. The weight of that small gesture seemed to bind past and present together. "Edward loved you so much," Thomas whispered, his voice thick. "And I promise to honor that love." He folded the letter and tucked it safely inside his coat. The walk back was quiet, the dog staying close at his side, their shadows stretching long in the streetlight's glow. At home, Thomas placed the letter on his kitchen counter, its presence filling the room with a strange warmth. He made tea, more for the comfort of holding something warm than for the taste, and sat on the floor beside the dog. "You really are something else," he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. The dog's tail thumped softly against the blanket. That night, as snow whispered against the windows, Thomas lay awake thinking of Edward's words. They weren't just a farewell, they were a passing of trust, a charge to protect, and Thomas knew he could not fail it. Morning light slipped through the curtains in pale ribbons, painting the floor in quiet gold. The dog, now Max in Thomas's mind, was curled at the foot of the bed, his breathing slow and steady. Thomas rose early, the letter still fresh in his thoughts. He read it again over coffee, the words striking just as deep as the night before. By midday, he knew he couldn't let the message remain just between them. Edward's love deserved to be remembered, not only in this house, but beyond its walls. He started with the neighbor who had spoken so warmly of Edward. Over tea at her kitchen table, Thomas told her about the letter, about finding it in the park, and about the way Max had led him there. The neighbor listened, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and wonder. "You should share this story," she said softly. "It could mean something to others, the way it clearly means something to you." Those words planted the idea. That evening, Thomas sat at his desk, the letter open beside him as he began to write. He told Edward's story from the beginning, his quiet kindness, his loyalty, his bond with Mac. He wrote of the nights the little dog waited outside the hospital, the blanket in the snow, the moment trust began to grow. When he was done, he sent it to a small local community board. He didn't expect much. But by the next morning, messages had already begun to appear. People thanked him for sharing. Some said they had seen the dog outside the hospital and wondered about his story. Others spoke of their own pets, their own losses, and how the story had touched them. Max seemed to sense the change. In the days that followed, his eyes softened, his steps became lighter. Though he still lingered by the front door at times, the long hours of staring into the dark became fewer. He began to greet Thomas at the door when he returned from work, tail wagging freely. One night, Thomas sat on the couch with Max's head resting on his lap. He reached for the letter on the table, holding it where the lamplight could touch the faded ink. "You gave him everything," Thomas said quietly, as if speaking to Edward himself. "And now I'll give him everything I can." In that moment, Thomas realized Edward's legacy wasn't just a memory. It was alive, curled up beside him, breathing steady and warm. And from that night forward, he knew it was no longer just about keeping a promise. It was about living it. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the snow shrinking into wet patches along the street. Thomas walked Max through the quiet neighborhood each morning, the leash slack between them, the air scented faintly with thawing earth. Life had settled into a steady rhythm. Rounds at the hospital, evenings at home, long walks that seemed to clear his mind. But one thought kept circling back, persistent as a pulse. Edward's life had ended with something left undone. That letter was full of love, but the neighbor had mentioned something else once, almost in passing, a wish Edward had spoken about before he died. Thomas needed to know. He started asking questions, speaking with people who had known Edward in passing. A retired vet at the corner cafe recalled Edward talking about opening a fund for local animal shelters. A former colleague at a supply store remembered him inquiring about mobile veterinary equipment for folks who couldn't get their pets to the clinic. The pieces came together. Edward hadn't just loved Max, he'd been dreaming of something bigger. A way to help more animals, more people, even when he could no longer be there in person. That evening, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the letter open beside him and Max curled at his feet. He traced a finger along the words, imagining Edward's voice, and felt a flicker of determination. He called the neighbor, then Sarah, then two others who had known Edward well. By nightfall, they had the beginnings of a plan. A mobile veterinary clinic. It would carry Edward's name, his memory, and his mission to help those who needed it most. When Thomas hung up the phone, Max looked up at him, ears perked as if he understood something had shifted. Thomas crouched to rub the fur along his neck. "We're going to finish what he started," he murmured. Outside, the last of the snow fell in slow, lazy flakes, catching in the glow of the streetlight. Inside, the warmth of a new purpose filled the small home. Edward's dream wasn't gone. It was waiting, just like Max had waited, for someone to carry it forward.